Hey, Adam.
Hey, Stephan.
It has been a very long time.
Yeah,
I think 3 years at this point.
yeah. At least,
Have I
at
have
least.
I made that joke before? I've probably made that joke before.
We really try. I mean, we really try to do this monthly, but it just somehow life gets in the way. That
Life does get in the way.
darn stinking thing called life.
It's awful. It's awful. Uh, but
But we're back.
we're back. It's so good to see you, and we haven't been talking nearly as much as we should be for sure.
Yeah.
But we're gonna jump right in. We have a cool book today. So the book is "Disappearance of the Universe." Straight talk about illusions, past lives, religion, sex, politics, and the miracles of forgiveness.
What?
As
That's
I
nice.
drop my earbud onto the table.
That's a
Anyway,
great title. I think that's a great
actually,
title.
it's a really
Pretty
good title.
engaging.
Subtitle.
Yeah.
I agree. So why don't you tell us about this book? I know you're more familiar with this material than I am, so I think today is going to be a lot of me asking questions of you.
Yes, but don't undersell yourself. There's so much you know, good sir. There's so
All
much you
right.
know. Well, this book was a breakout bestseller by author and teacher Gary Renard. From my recollection, it took him 9 years to write this book and then publish it. And I think the interesting thing for a lot of people out there, in case you're interested in reading this, what happened to Gary is I mean, we'll talk a little bit about Gary, but he basically had two people materialize out of thin air, according to him, present themselves to him basically in normal clothing, and told him that they were ascended masters, and basically enlightened masters who had escaped the confines of the illusion of reality and were guiding him to basically begin his spiritual journey, because he's very much not a spiritual man.
He was a banker, right?
Definitely
Or
not.
was it no? What was it? What was
No,
his
he was a
profession?
He was a guitarist. He was
Oh, okay, got it. Okay. Why
a
did I think he was like a financial day trader or something like
oh
that?
no, you're right. You're right. Actually, he did day trading. I think
Okay.
For quite a while actually.
Day
It was like
trading slash guitarist.
yeah, so that was his
Classic
thing.
combination.
You should tell him that. He
I will.
basically he was a guitarist, and his band was called Hush. Apparently, there's another band named Hush that's more well known, but he was in Boston and Maine
Okay.
when he was part of the band, and they're super busy. They had so many gigs. He eventually moved to Maine, where things got a little bit quieter, and it was mostly during his time while living in Maine that these masters appeared before him periodically, and they would basically teach him about basics of reality, metaphysics, and it sounds wild. It really does. But if you just put that aside and imagine just three people having conversation, two of whom are very wise people, and Gary sort of representing the everyman, because he very much is the everyman. He's not. He'll say it himself. He is not well read, and he's not a very learned man, and he's proud of the fact. And I think that goes to show, like, the stuff that he's talking about. The stuff in this book is like advanced non-dual metaphysics. And I mean, we both have studied this material at length, in a very scholarly way, and there's no way that someone who has not read anything could talk about this. So I truly feel like it's very likely that Gary had a pretty profound experience that has led him to write this amazing book. Anyway, that's the preface.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is in the same vein as. When I say vein, I mean the same general metaphysics of life and teachings of the Masters of the Far East. Correct?
Oh, that's
Generally.
I mean, yeah. Oh, Gary would say that he's stands unique, I guess, in
Sure.
in what he's teaching. But I think that the point you're trying to make is like, yeah, it's ascended masters presenting themselves to him, giving him very mystical, profound teachings. In that
Right.
sense,
I'm
very
more
similar.
getting at that we've encountered ascended masters before in our
Oh,
in
oh,
our
yeah, yeah,
discussions, because like you
yes,
say ascended master, I don't know if people know what that is, but I think we've covered it in Life and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. So
yeah,
if you
that's true.
aren't familiar, basically ascended masters are beings who have, like you said earlier, they have essentially broken out of the illusion and can come and go at will and see through it completely. And so the you I think ascended masters, what we call them in the West, I think is Siddha or Mahasiddha, is probably an equivalent in the East of some sort in terms of what people would name them, but essentially extremely advanced spiritual being who can come and go at will and has fully seen through the
They've
illusion.
escaped the matrix
They've escaped the matrix fully.
fully.
Yeah, I mean, and this is crazy too because this book gets into dimensions, it gets into time, it goes really deep, like really deep. And I'm not as familiar with that, so I'm going to ask you about these things. And I think you have a bit more experience with those aspects, and I'm usually the one who talks to you about dimensions and time, and we have great conversations. But I'm sure we'll get into that.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, I mean, why don't we? Well, I was curious your experience. So, when you first picked up the book, just from the first couple of pages, what was your impression? How did it read? What sort of associations came up for you?
Well, my first kind of experience of the book was relating it to experiences that I've had in the past, reading like the I Am material and Lives and Teachings of the Masters of the Far East. It felt, especially the I Am material, which is in very, I would say, old English, not actual old English, but English that is from the 20s and like
Yeah,
formal English from the 20s. And so sometimes it's hard to follow and get into. I had
like
very
Shakespearean English.
maybe not that bad, but it's just hard to get into. It's very formal and rigid, and that's fine. It was the first kind of experience of the West with ascended masters, for lack of a better word, and it is what it is. And there's still beautiful books, and I myself had a very profound experience with Saint Germain when I first read the first I Am book. As I put it down, I like felt a presence in front of me that I felt was Saint Germain. I couldn't see anything or anything, but I really felt like Saint Germain there in front of me as I finished the book. And so
Oh
I've
wow.
had a relationship with Saint Germain ever since. Um, but it reminded me of that in much fresher, no nonsense language, which is great because those books are beautiful and full of great energy, but they're hard to read. Uh,
That's a
it's
really
just
good.
page after page after page of discourse. So
Yeah, it's a good way of that's a good analogy too, because if you go back to the I Am series, the person who interacted with Saint Germain was Guy Ballard,
hmm
and he was a very proper, upstanding citizen. He did everything correctly. He probably filed his taxes on time, and he
no need to out yourself like that, Adam.
That's hilarious. Um, but like if personally, I
Yeah,
also got a lot out of those books, but
me too.
I didn't um see myself in Guy Ballard. I didn't resonate with.
No, no, not at all.
It's
No,
like, no,
very, yeah,
I'm not
very,
like him, you know.
yeah, no, not at all.
But whereas Gary, I can kind of relate to him. I mean, maybe not as sassy and irreverent.
Yeah,
You may be a little bit. Gary is definitely more irreverent and sassy than I am, but he felt definitely a 21st century person.
yeah, absolutely, for sure.
Like what would happen if an ascended master presented to someone nowadays, and the kind of conversations we would have. The other cool thing that I liked about it was they did in fact talk about some current events at the time, like tsunamis that had. I think there was that big tsunami in Indonesia or something.
Hmm.
So it was kind of nice to see. Okay, well, how are these masters talking about current events, and how do they help Gary see it differently?
Yeah. So I think I want to get into what are the kind of the fundamental premise of this metaphysics and worldview, unless you have a different idea of a place you want to go.
No, that's perfect. That's really perfect.
Okay,
Um,
so
Good.
these two ascended masters show up at Gary's house on his couch. They say, "Hey, we're ascended masters. Try not to freak out." And he doesn't really know what ascended masters are. They have to explain that to him. They explain who they are, things like that, and then they basically start telling him that we're here for your education, to your spiritual training, and we're going to show up a series of times, a number of times, and to kind of lay out what's going on for you. And eventually you will turn this into a book. And, then I don't, it'll go on from there. But the interesting thing is the metaphysics. And so what I really got out of this, so if you've listened to this podcast, I've studied a lot of Buddhism, and Buddhism is a lot of my worldview in terms of, metaphysics, I'd say. And one thing I really like about this is it ends up getting into A Course in Miracles. It starts referencing A Course in Miracles a lot. And what I really like about it is it's non-dualism, but with a positive outlook without being positivist. I don't know how else to describe it. So one of my criticisms of, coming from both more of a Hindu Indian background and then a Buddhist background, I see strengths and weaknesses in both. And I think one of Buddhism's strengths is its ability to cut through illusion. But one of its weaknesses is that it tends me especially towards pessimism and to nihilism. And Hinduism, on the other hand, I feel I find a very positivist language that leads one to thinking there's a sense of permanence in terms of what we see around us, because it doesn't quite cut through enough for me. So this material I find cuts through really well and still it doesn't allow me to be pessimistic. So I really appreciate this material. I really, having discovered it ever since starting to read this book and then talking to you about it and diving into A Course in Miracles more, I've really appreciated the material.
Well, I've never heard it explained so well, and I don't think you ever shared that with me either. That's
Thank
fantastic.
you. I'm here all week. So would
Just a
you
week?
mind laying out kind of the basic metaphysics according to this worldview?
Yeah. So, and I should be in upfront too here. Gary and I are friends. I really enjoy the man. I love spending time with him. And so there's the material is personal as well too.
Yeah.
But that said, I'm going to give a fairly objective.
Well, you can speak to your own experience too. You don't have to just give the textbook answer.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll do both. I am
Okay.
capable of multiple points of view. Okay. So, first of all, Disappearance of the Universe is fundamentally Gary's journey, his journey over 9 years with these Ascended Masters. But everything is ultimately pointing to A Course in Miracles. So it sort of begs the question, well, what is A Course in Miracles? A Course in Miracles is a text, a huge, huge text that was given to a woman named Helen Schuckman. Yep. So that
for those watching,
Stephen is holding up the books.
Not looking at us not watching on YouTube. I'm showing the books right now.
Yeah. So, A Course in Miracles is given to a woman named Helen Schuckman. She was a psychologist, a psychology professor at Columbia University. Essentially, the voice that spoke to her was the voice of the historical Jesus Christ, and he basically wanted to set the record straight through her and clarify what his teachings were at the time that he was alive. And by setting the record straight, I mean like not have any of the distortions that came into Christianity afterwards. Nothing against Christianity. I'm just sharing the perspective of A Course in
No,
Miracles.
and just a little, if I can jump in real quick,
Yeah.
in my experience of reading this book is the Ascended Masters basically talk about, one of them reveals themselves as Thomas.
That's right.
And I think it's Persa, I believe. I can't remember which one. I
Persa.
think it's Persa. He was in a female body in the store in Disappearance, but basically says back then none of us understood what Jesus was talking about. Like not a single one of us got it. And ever since then it's been confused because no one that was with Jesus at the time really understood what he was talking about. It took us a long time to figure it out, and most of us, almost none of us, did. And so the confusion of Christianity, the textual Christianity especially, just compounded from there because not a single person really got what Jesus was talking about. So when you say Jesus setting the record straight, this is Jesus's direct voice setting the record straight, not through like interpreters 200 years after passing down oral traditions.
Exactly.
From people who didn't even know what he was talking about in the first place.
Yeah. Thanks, Stephen. It's exactly right. It's the actual Jesus who presents himself to Helen Schuckman. And that's what Helen's experience was. And so she takes down these words that like appear before her, along with another gentleman who basically is her co-scribe. So William Thetford. So, and he was also a psychologist and her boss. But they both worked at Columbia. And the crazy thing is, like, Columbia's super rigid, conservative. To hear that two psychologists are basically scribing down a voice that came to Helen like that, it's just it's crazy. They would have labeled her crazy, so they kept it under wraps for a long time, well after their retirement. But the book then became A Course in Miracles, what is now known today as A Course in Miracles. And what's going back to Gary, what's amazing is he hadn't heard of any of this, right? So these masters appeared to him, they're like, you're going to write a book. And I mean, to paraphrase Gary a little bit, his response was like, "The hell I am! You can't make me do what I don't want to do." But eventually, he ends up writing this amazing book because he picks up A Course in Miracles and he ends up reading it. Now, to answer your question, what's the metaphysical foundation?
What would you say, in your own words, Adam? What would you say the metaphysics are?
Okay, in my own understanding and interpretation, it basically boils down to there is no world. Everything that we see around us is an illusion or a dream. And it's a dream based on a fundamental premise. And the premise is that we have separated from Source. We have separated from God. And this belief in separation permeates all aspects of this dream reality. And the fundamental teaching is that the way back home is simply remembering we've never left. And that's pretty huge. So there's a couple of things. One is everything you see, this world around us is a total illusion. It's a dream, but absolutely in line with all the wisdom traditions of the East for the most part. And then goes to say it's not real. It doesn't exist. You as a separate individual are not real and you don't exist. Again, very, very similar to Buddhism in that sense. And then goes further and says, and you remain one with the only reality that ever was and that ever is. And that reality is God or Source, however you want to word that. A pure, unified, constant state. And you are that. Not you are a part of it, but you are all of it. You are that. There's no separation in that. And essentially, our journey, the spiritual work to be done according to A Course in Miracles, is we have to forgive the illusions in front of us. And this goes into a probably Gary's biggest contribution. I think, to not only the world of A Course in Miracles, but just to spirituality, was he really reminds people it's all about forgiveness. It all boils down to forgiveness. That said, it's not traditional forgiveness where someone did something wrong and you're going to be the better man or woman and sort of an act of charity allow them to not be punished in your eyes, right? That's sort of an arrogant way of forgiving. It's because it makes them wrong and you right. What Gary talks about is this true deep forgiveness, which is that you essentially see through the illusion of them having done something wrong, and you recognize they've done nothing wrong, and not only that, they're not even there, and you're not there, and you've done nothing wrong, and so none of it is real. You're always at home with God, and you're always innocent, and you've never not been innocent. And when you, for me, and I'm going to tie this back to Buddhism, that's an element of Trek Show that I really like. It's like this. It's a slicing through. Like you're not saying, oh, that person did something wrong and I'm going to forgive them. It's like you cut through the illusion of the idea of wrongness. There's no sin. There's no wrongness. You cut through right through all the bullshit and you recognize there only ever was innocence and oneness. And you're that. You are that.
Beautifully said. Yeah, no, really. And this is, I think that's what I really appreciate about this material is that coming back to innocence, that coming back to that sense of peace. It's like there's, yeah, it's the pessimism can't grab a hold through that, into that, because Buddhism tends to leave you with nothing, which can quickly become something, which does become something, because we can't stop making things something. But
that's very true, actually.
Thank you. That's another one. I'm here all week. Oh, it's free, Adam.
Why just a week?
I don't know. It's just something.
I want to read something from the introduction of
A
Course in
please.
Miracles.
That's our first quote.
First quote, yeah. Now,
from a different book.
Although there are 365 quotes from A Course in Miracles in Gary's book, and his teachers tell him they do that on purpose. For those who want to really go into Gary's book, you basically have one quote per day of the year. But more than that, specifically they chose those 365 quotes because it encapsulates the idea of the major fundamental premises of A Course in Miracles. And you can get a sense of the entirety of A Course in Miracles just from reading Gary's book. And I think they did it on purpose. So here's my quote. This is from the introduction. This course can therefore be summed up very simply in this way. Nothing real can be threatened, and nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. It's immensely profound. And I'm just going to say it again here. Nothing real can be threatened. Right? And I think that's so critical because so much of what we suffer from fundamentally boils down to an expression of fear. And when you realize nothing real can be threatened, there goes the fear. And then nothing unreal exists. There's nothing else out there. There is no world. In fact, there's later on in the workbook, which is something we can talk about. There's a workbook aspect to this. It says there is no world. This is the central thought this course attempts to teach. There is no world. And nothing unreal exists. So herein lies the peace of God. And I remember when I first read that, I was like, oh, yeah, this is it. This is the peace of non-duality. When you can get that all of the worries, all the day-to-day worries, all the troubles, the tribulations, the challenges, the upsets, the death, the suffering, the pain, the disease, none of it's real. All of it's a dream. And I, more than anyone, know this is not meant to be said to minimize anyone's suffering. It's simply a gateway to really help recognize, just like when we have nightmares at night and then we wake up, we don't minimize the suffering that occurred in our nightmare by saying it was a dream, but we recognize it was in fact a dream and that you didn't suffer, and the things that happened in your nightmare never actually occurred. And that's like the direct analogy of what's happening here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's that, gosh, the world does not exist. Like, that's such a profound statement. Because for me, just in my own like experience, when people say, "Oh, the world is an illusion," it's like, okay, like an illusion, like,
Yeah. What do you do with that?
well, illusions exist because an illusion is something. Illusion is an illusion.
Yeah.
But just the statement, "The world does not exist," is, for me, that's like stops my brain. That like completely stops my brain. It's like the world does not. It's like, oh, okay, it's a complete lifting and a complete freedom, as opposed to the world is an illusion, because an illusion is still a thing called an illusion, right? Like it still is. It still has a substance.
That's a great.
At least that's the way it appears to me. You know?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. Like illusions, like optical illusions, right? You're seeing something that isn't there, but there actually is still something there. It's just twisted in a certain way.
It's not what you think it is. Yeah,
it's not what you think it is.
Yeah, so it's like this is why for me this material is really useful, because before reading this material, I would see that, oh, the world is an illusion, and it's kind of like, okay, how do I view it in a way that is healthy? What this thing in front of me, my hand. Okay, my hand is an illusion. How do I view it in a way that's healthy? And I've just never had, like, not never, but like it's hard for me to have access to what's the healthy way to look at it. And for some reason, the term, just kind of the phrase like the world does not exist, just it stops my mind from even asking that question.
Yeah, it does. That's a good point. You know,
But that's go ahead. I want to keep going on that thought, but please.
No, it's a really good point. That distinction between illusion or not. One of the metaphysical premises of what Gary ends up talking about is that the world we see is at its fundamental core a projection from our own mind. And everything we see is not actually out there. All of it is in here, so to speak. And the projection is a projection from the belief that the separation actually occurred. Like I'm separate. I'm separate from the world. And so we end up projecting a reality, a seeming reality, where the law of separation is very abundant and very clear. You see separated people everywhere. There's like billions of human beings, trillions of planets and stars, and all you see is a cosmos with separated entities. And the interesting thing is when you recognize that the way you perceive something outside of you is how you perceive yourself. Because there's a part of your mind, and this is such a critical teaching, there's a part of your mind that remembers, that knows that this world is not real, that it came from within, so to speak. And so when someone does something to you and you say, well, that guy is an asshole, or I can't believe something happened like this, when you blame that person, whatever you say about that person, your mind on a very deep primordial level takes that to be about yourself. And so that's why the power of the forgiveness work is you basically cut through someone's appearing illusion of sin or doing something wrong. You see them as innocent, and you recognize that they're not actually there. Nothing ever happened, and they're in fact innocent. Then what happens in your mind, you internalize that to be about yourself. I did nothing wrong. Then the guilt that we've been holding on, this primordial guilt of having separated from our creator, so to speak, starts to dissolve. And that's the whole point. You keep seeing innocence in your brother, keep seeing innocence in the people around you. cutting through the appearance of illusion, the appearance of sin, and seeing them for their innocence, and then the guilt inside dissolves deeper and deeper until there's nothing left. And this is critical. When there's nothing left, there's no friction anymore. There's no guilt. There's no belief in sin, and the sense of self, the illusion of an independent self, completely dissolves. So Stephen ceases to be, and that would be akin to enlightenment. There might still be a body, and other people might point to that body and say that's Stephen, but the internal experience is there's no more separate self. It's a full awakening. Oh, and the reason why I brought this up was if you start to say everything's an illusion, but you don't actually take the next step and remind yourself that there's only God, there's only that light and that love, the unchangeable purity of God. If you just stop at the illusion and then you internalize that, like I was saying, you basically say, oh, that's an illusion, therefore I must be an illusion. But because you have nothing to replace it with, all it leaves you with is a sense of meaninglessness and depression.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it sure does. It's so that this is new for me. Like this material is new for me, and you have a lot more like experience with it. And although I've touched on it over the years, and it's not the first. I remember I must have heard of A Course in Miracles like 10 years ago at least. But I was never into it, and that sense that you brought up, that sense of guilt, I can remember like the first time for me, like that I met my teacher. I remember, I think I've talked about it on an episode or something. I remember like the second I saw her, I just started bawling my eyes out. And she was wearing this really beautiful silk dress. And I remember just crying and snotting all over it because she put my head in her lap. And I felt like guilty, but I still felt okay but what I was thinking about when you said that, what reminded me is the sense of like, I'm okay. That like, there's that innocence, like I am okay. Like there's nothing wrong with me. And it's such an overwhelming feeling of peace that this isn't about that moment or that teacher, but it's a visceral feeling. When you said that, it reminded me of that moment of there is something so deep in us that like remembers. And when we do remember, it's such a relief.
Yeah. And that can't be overstated. We don't realize how heavy the burden is of this guilt. We think it's normal until something happens where you're guided to the feeling that you had that, oh, I'm actually okay.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with me. There's nothing, and I've never did anything wrong. Like when you feel it, that's when you start to realize, oh my God, I've been holding such a heavy burden for so long, because you only notice it when you let it go, how light you feel and how peaceful things get internally.
Yeah, we're like creating a hallucination of hell for ourselves.
We are.
Like we literally are creating a hallucination of hell. It's like having a bad trip your entire life. It really is. Like it's
you're
awful.
born.
It's
you're born
awful.
and you're given a mega dose of shrooms or acid, and it lasts for 90 years.
Yeah, exactly. No, but it does. I mean, it's clear from reading this material and just doing a little bit of. I mean, I've just started the workbook, so I went from the Disappearance of the Universe, and then I got A Course in Miracles, and then Course in Miracles has a text that's very biblical, and like even if you have this book and you flip through it, like this version of it, the paper is like super thin, like a Bible. Like it's very reminiscent of something that a lot of us would be familiar with, having grown up with Bibles. But it is no, obviously that's on purpose, whatever. But it is dense, not like biblical, not quite as bad as the Bible in terms of like readability. It's much more readable than the Bible, but it's still like biblical language. And then I remember you telling me just do the workbook, because like the workbook, I thought I was going to be cheating. I was like, oh, I haven't done the material.
Oh,
And you said, no, the workbook is really how you start understanding the material,
yeah.
not the other way around. Thank God I listened to you. I don't always, but thank God I did. And it's been really good. I'm not that far into it, but just it's you and I have talked about this a lot, about the similarities of Lojong, which is Buddhist mind training, and the Course in Miracles. And I had no reference for it before because I hadn't done it, but I completely see the similarities. And right at the beginning, it starts cutting through the illusion and showing us that all we see are our thoughts, and our thoughts are completely, they're from the past. We're not seeing the present, because everything we're seeing is filtered through the experience of our past, and so we're not actually seeing anything as it stands. We're seeing the past version of it that's stuck in our heads.
Yeah.
And then it starts going into like, we think the world is meaningless, like this is now a meaningless world. And then it starts getting into, we create the meaning, like we're the ones who say it's meaningless because we are basically in a battle with, this is kind of where I'm at, as I think this is today's or yesterday's, but we are in, when you have a meaningless world, your ego fills the void, and your
Mm,
ego creates me. So you're basically imposing some sort of, trying to find meaning in a meaningless world, which leads to which is the sense of loss, this sense of being lost that we've just been talking about, where nothing makes sense, where there is no answer to anything ever.
yeah.
There's only pain. Sometimes there's moments of happiness, but there's only pain. And that lines up very much with my experiences of Buddhism, but also of Lojong too. And they're different; they're not the same for sure. But
N-
this is a really gradated step by step, and it's been very powerful, even doing it for a few days.
Yeah, I highly recommend it. For you don't need to be a student of A Course in Miracles to get benefit. In fact, I'll tell a lot of people, if they're willing to listen, just do the workbook. That's it. Just do the workbook. Nothing else. If you do nothing else, that's it. Just do that workbook. It's designed to basically deconstruct the way you perceive reality and yourself. And the power is, once it deconstructs that for you, you're never left without a hand to hold. You'll have a hand to hold, metaphorically speaking, as your reality breaks down in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
And then the second half of the workbook is to reconstruct your way of living life with true perception. I'll just read here, as it actually says, I'll quote here: the workbook is divided into two main sections. The first dealing with the undoing of the way you see now, and the second with the acquisition of true perception. And I really like this because you and I, we've talked about this, how the spiritual path, you have this, like, I think it's called apophatic and cataphatic paths.
Don't you use those big words with me, young man.
Fancy words coming up.
I've never heard those words before, just for the record.
What? We talked about
Yeah.
this.
But I don't think we call them those fancy words.
Yeah. So I guess
You're scaring me. Stop using those.
the two ideas are that most spiritual paths can be broken down to two broad categories. One is the acquisition of more and more knowledge until you become wiser and wiser and wiser, and you reach this pinnacle of wisdom and knowledge. But the idea is learn more, grow more, gain more. That's the goal. There's another path which is about undoing and basically unlearning. Society has told you a whole bunch of things. You've picked up a whole bunch of things about who you think you are and what society is, and your relation to it. But then this particular path is a path of undoing all of those beliefs until you're left with reality. And in this case, your oneness with Source, which is love. So this is very much in the latter form. It is about undoing your false beliefs about yourself, and then leaving you with what is real. And this is one thing I want to say. If this can be get kind of heady, the material, but it's important to realize why we're talking about this, and the reason why Buddha himself decided to go on the path. Buddha saw a diseased man, he saw an aging person, and then he saw someone die. And these were the three sights, right? When he was leaving his palace, when he was a young man. Suffering is real. It's real for every one of us. It is so painful to live this life. It's so challenging just to be a freaking human being. It's so hard. And the teaching here is it doesn't have to be. You have to first recognize that we're doing it to ourselves. It's being made up from our minds. And when we start to understand the process of how that happens, it can be undone. You're doing one of your silence things. I'm glad there's finally video so people can see you holding back your laughter. But for those who are listening, you can't see.
No, it's everything you're saying is true. I'm silent because I don't have anything to add, Adam. You said so perfectly. But then I see you reacting to me, thinking I'm doing it on purpose, and so then I'm like, oh, I'm gonna make sure
you're gonna draw it out
on purpose.
Yeah, exactly. I think
you
I
show
can tolerate,
and then I pounce.
Yeah, you're like a cat. Is that true that you're not supposed to turn your back on a leopard or a puma?
That's right? True. You don't. Yeah.
Don't. So I think I metaphorically turned my back on you, and then you pounced. It's just for a second. I think I can tolerate awkward silence for about 15 seconds. Past that, it gets uncomfortable.
Well, we've done that once on this podcast, and I don't think we need to do it again.
Please spare us.
I don't remember what episode, but if you're aching to hear 60 seconds of awkward silence as I torture Adam, listen to all the episodes. It's somewhere.
Yeah, he did it at some point.
So one of the things that when you were sharing that brought got brought up in my mind was you talked about how there's a hand to hold you the whole way through. So that I think is really important. And I know we started off talking about Disappearance of the Universe. That's what this episode's technically on, but it's about Course in Miracles.
It is.
They just don't. They just don't talk about it always. So now we're going to talk about Course in Miracles, and there's the one hand of so many spiritual realizations they can be really harsh, and I think a lot of people don't, if they haven't been around or haven't had them, they can be harsh. You can get a wake up call that feels really good, and you feel like you have a lot of wisdom, and then all of a sudden, all your old habits come back, and all of all the ego comes rushing back in when you least expect it, and it's really brutal. And it's happened to me more times than I care to remember. But one of the things I'm really loving about A Course in Miracles is that, like you said, there's a hand to hold. So every workbook, it starts slowly breaking down your reality, and it's very gentle. There's no sense of like, hi, now I'm going to push you off a cliff. Good luck. I'll see you at the bottom. And there's no sense of that whatsoever. It's very gentle. And so I want to give it props for that. And the second thing I want to give it props for is, I grew up, my parents took me to an Episcopalian preschool. When I got older, like first grade onwards, they tried to find churches for us to go to. They weren't overly religious people, but they both grown up with their own like kind of Christian backgrounds. I think my mom's Catholic. My dad is probably not. I don't know what they are in Boston. They're probably Catholic too. Let's be real.
Yeah, Roman Catholic.
Yeah, but they didn't really care, but they wanted some sort of structure, some sort of something for their for the
Boston
kid. And
Catholic. Is that a thing?
yeah, definitely, 100%. I think a lot of depends what kind of part of Boston you're from, though, and I don't have a encyclopedic memory of which area of Boston is Catholic and which is Protestant. It's mini Ireland.
Yeah.
Um, so, but anyway, so I grew up getting kicked out of churches because I would always ask questions that nobody liked and yada yada yada.
Good
But
for
anyway,
you.
so sure, yeah, big props to me. I mean, it saved me for sure from having to answer these, having to make that breakout when I was an adult, I suppose. But the point of all that is that it's using, this is using biblical language. He's using the words like God, He, capital H, He,
Oh yeah, very
capital H,
traditional.
Him, Holy Spirit, things like this. My relationship to those words, as someone who's like seen it from the outside, is like, I don't know if I want to go there. I don't know if I want. I don't really have a
Yeah.
relationship with those words, and they're very Christian, and it never really mean much to me. Now, my wife, for example, she went to Catholic school, so she has very strong relationship to those words, and they're not necessarily great relationships. And so I've enjoyed being slowly broken into it and for them to explain the context for their use of those words, because I feel like instead of running away from those words and that language and saying, oh no, it reminds me of something bad, which I think a lot of people have that experience. It's like there's a reclaiming it, but in truth, in a
Yeah.
non-dual reclaiming of it, which I think is really beautiful and powerful, because there is power to those words. There is power to God with a capital G, to He, Him. Like those kind of biblical words. There is power to it. Now you don't have to, like, obviously there's lots of words to use. There's all sorts of words to use, but I'm just appreciating that it's easing me into it, and it's not just like, okay, we're going to go to church again, because that's not what I want. And A Course in Miracles is admittedly a self-study course.
Oh
It's
yeah.
not something that's
There's
like you're
no church around
yeah,
this.
there's no church around this whatsoever. I think there are like work groups that go through that like discuss things together and things like that, but it's not there's no pastor,
Yeah.
there's no like officiant that's a mediary between you and whatever
Right.
God, I guess. But anyway, so it's all self-study, and it's meant to be that way, and it's really refreshing is where I'm going with that. Um and it's very gentle, which I've appreciated, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the sort of positive language that it's using in its when it's building back up. I'm still in the breaking down part.
Yeah, and you really do need to completely just tear apart your reality, because there's so much that we've learned that's just wrong. It's just fundamentally wrong, but it's the way society is structured. It's on false premises. Something I want to point out too is that this is just one form of what I think is a universal curriculum. There's a universal truth, but the truth necessarily takes different forms. This is a form, one form, and it's a form that uses Christian language because the voice is reclaiming his teachings as they were originally meant to be taught. But we talked about aliens, right? These teachings that reality as we know it is an illusion, that separation from source has never occurred, that those core ideas are probably expressed in a completely different form on another planet with an intelligent species over there, right? So I
You
think,
were getting at this in our aliens episode, and I didn't
yeah,
let you go there at the time, but yeah,
yeah, I think
I'm glad you're getting there now.
yeah, it only took a couple episodes
Alien
later.
Jesus.
Alien Jews. Basically, it's like, okay, what would you say to someone with a vastly different
Yeah,
culture, vastly different history?
yeah.
The form is different. And there's a line here I'm going to quote. It says, theological considerations as such are necessarily controversial, since they depend on belief and can therefore be accepted or rejected. A universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary. That's from the Manual for Teachers. It's, again, also part of A Course in Miracles, but it's a very clear, very relatively famous quotation. It's not espousing a universal theology.
Can you read it one more time?
Yeah. A universal theology is impossible, but a universal experience is not only possible, but necessary.
Mm-hmm.
A universal experience. And we're starting to touch upon it. The universal experience of feeling, like viscerally knowing you've done nothing wrong. You're innocent. You are whole and complete. And most importantly, you are so, so loved. You're so, so loved. And feeling it. I know you've had that experience multiple times. I have too. We've had different contexts that brought it about. But it is transformative when you really feel like you are unconditionally loved. Huge walls of pain will fall apart and you will feel yourself to be a new person.
Wow. All right. Well, I mean, is there anything else you want to talk about for this one? I feel like we've covered the juicy bits. Not that we've talked about the book directly that much, but I feel like we've done it justice.
I think we have. Gary, more than anyone, would say, it's not
Stop
about
talking.
him. He would say,
yeah.
He would say, it's not about him. It's about the Course anyway. So I think we covered what needed to be covered.
Yeah. Any last thoughts? I mean, that was a good last thought, the one you just had, and now I've ruined it by talking over you. So
thanks, Stephen.
Classic.
It's like when an artist keeps painting and they don't stop the painting; they just ruin it.
They ruin it.
You ruined it. You
That's
ruined
me.
the painting that we would have had.
You're welcome.
A story of your life and my life with you.
Oh, so kind of you. Wow. So kind of you to include yourself. My last thoughts, I would say give Course in Miracles workbook a try for real. It's really good stuff. And just getting back to that sense of peace, that sense of being loved, that sense of innocence, as you put it, I think is worth the trip.
Absolutely. Thanks, Stephen.
Well, I'll talk to you next month.
Or 3 years from now.
Or 3 years. Yeah, who knows? roll of the dice.